When most people think about World War II history, they imagine massive invasions, artillery blasts, and coordinated armies. But on Guadalcanal, the tide sometimes turned because of a single marksman with the right skills. That's where Second Lieutenant John George steps into the story. Before he became known for outshooting Japanese snipers in the Point Cruz Groves, George was simply an Illinois state shooting champion, a man who understood rifles on a level few soldiers did. What makes his story stand out in military history is the fact that he carried not a standard-issue M1 Garand, but a personally purchased Winchester Model 70, equipped with a Lyman Alaskan scope, a setup his fellow officers mocked as a mail-order toy. Yet that rifle would later redefine American thinking about sniper tactics and individual marksmanship in jungle warfare. George's early arrival on Guadalcanal contrasts sharply with the chaos unfolding around him. The 132nd Infantry Regiment had relieved exhausted Marines who had been fighting since August, and the Japanese were still deeply entrenched in the jungle. While the Marines had secured Henderson Field, enemy sharpshooters continued using the dense canopy and towering banyan trees to inflict casualties. At this point, George had 0 confirmed kills, and no one, least of all his own officers, believed his sporting rifle had any place in World War II combat. But George knew something they didn't. The principles of precision, patience, and consistency he had mastered in competition shooting translated perfectly into the unpredictable terrain of jungle warfare. The tension built as casualties mounted. The 132nd Regiment had already lost multiple men to hidden Japanese snipers, men who climbed high into banyans and waited motionless for hours. These weren't random shots from inexperienced soldiers. These were carefully executed kills carried out by trained marksmen using Arisaka rifles, men who understood concealment, elevation, and timing. The threat was so severe that at one point, the battalion commander admitted the snipers were killing his men faster than malaria. That's when he summoned George and finally asked, could that Winchester Model 70 actually hit anything in combat? George's response wasn't bravado. He explained his long-range shooting credentials, his competition groups at 600 yards, his familiarity with the Lyman Alaskan scope, and why a bolt-action sniper-style rifle might outperform a semi-automatic M1 Garand in certain conditions. Although the Garand offered faster follow-up shots, the Winchester delivered consistency, accuracy, and a trigger he had personally tuned. In a battlefield like the Point Cruz Groves, where shots had to be precise and movement meant death, those advantages mattered. This chapter sets the foundation for one of the most extraordinary World War II sniper accounts ever recorded, an account preserved in George's own memoir, Shots Fired in Anger, one of the most cited works in firearms and military history. What follows is not legend or myth, but the first-hand record of a man who proved that individual skill could shift the balance in one of the deadliest environments of the Pacific War. Before long, his once mocked rifle would become the tool that changed everything, both for his battalion and for American sniper doctrine. The story of John George truly begins when his long-awaited Winchester Model 70 finally reached Guadalcanal, a rifle he had purchased with 2 years of National Guard pay and shipped through military mail. While other soldiers cleaned their M1 Garands, George's rifle sat in a warehouse thousands of miles away, a delay that seemed almost symbolic. The Army didn't believe a privately owned sporting rifle belonged in modern WWII history. When the rifle finally arrived in late December 1942, packed in a wooden crate marked "Fragile," George instantly recognized what it represented. This wasn't just a weapon. It was the tool that would allow him to challenge professionally trained Japanese snipers who had turned the Point Cruz Groves into a killing field. The contrast between the rifles was obvious. The Garand was semi-automatic, mass-produced, and suited for the average infantryman, exactly what American doctrine demanded as the war industrialized. But George's Winchester Model 70, equipped with a Lyman Alaskan scope, was designed for precision rather than volume. It was the rifle of a marksman, not a line soldier. The officers didn't see it that way. His commanding officer told him to carry a real weapon, while others joked about his mail-order sweetheart. Even the armorer mocked the rifle, asking if it was meant for deer instead of Japanese infantry. Yet George ignored them. He understood ballistics, optics, trigger discipline, and the subtleties that separated ordinary shooters from true craftsmen. In a hostile environment like jungle warfare, mastery mattered far more than rate of fire. But Guadalcanal wasn't merely hostile. It was chaotic, humid, disease-ridden, and deadly. The WWII history of this island is soaked in mud, sweat, and fear. The Marines had fought non-stop since August, securing Henderson Field but failing to clear Japanese resistance from the groves and the steep ridges of Mount Austin. These areas offered perfect conditions for sniper tactics, high vantage points, thick foliage, and endless concealment. The Japanese understood terrain in a way that felt almost instinctive, and their Japanese snipers blended into banyan trees so massive that a man could sit hidden in them all day without being detected. They waited silently for the perfect moment to fire a single shot, a single crack that echoed through the jungle and left another American soldier dead. The scale of the problem became undeniable. Over 72 brutal hours, 14 Americans from the 132nd Infantry Regiment were killed by unseen marksmen. These weren't random engagements, they were deliberate executions carried out with discipline and patience. The Point Cruz Groves had turned into an invisible battlefield where movement meant exposure, and exposure meant death. This was the turning point where battlefield necessity finally forced the officers to reconsider their skepticism. The battalion commander called George into his tent late at night. He didn't want jokes and he didn't want theory. He wanted results. Could George's long-dismissed Winchester Model 70 actually perform under combat conditions? Could he stand alone as a counter-sniper against an enemy trained specifically for jungle warfare? George replied not with ego, but with facts. His competition record, his long-distance accuracy, his knowledge of lights like the Lyman Alaskan, and his experience reading wind and light. He reminded the commander that the essentials of precision shooting remained constant whether in Illinois cornfields or the Pacific jungle. He knew his rifle. He trusted its trigger, its bedding, its bolt, and its consistent accuracy. Where the M1 Garand offered speed, the Winchester offered certainty. And in this environment, certainty meant survival. As the officers listened, their earlier mockery evaporated. For the first time, they viewed George not as the eccentric lieutenant with a hunting rifle, but as a potential solution to a problem that had overwhelmed entire platoons. The battalion commander gave him until dawn to prove the rifle's worth, a test that would take place not on a training range, but on a battlefield where the enemy had already demonstrated deadly skill. This moment marks the quiet shift in George's story, the point where skepticism turned into possibility. His rifle was no longer a curiosity. It was about to become one of the most consequential weapons in WWII sniper lore. The stage was set for the extraordinary events that would unfold in the days ahead, events that would reshape how the American military understood individual marksmanship, optics, and long-range precision in dense jungle combat. The Point Cruz Groves were waiting, and so were the Japanese snipers who believed they owned that terrain. Dawn would reveal who truly understood the art of the shot. Before John George ever fired a shot with his Winchester Model 70, the Point Cruz Groves had already earned a dark reputation across World War II history. American patrols feared entering the banyan forests west of Henderson Field because the enemy lurking there was not ordinary infantry. These were Japanese snipers, masters of concealment who understood jungle warfare better than anyone the Americans had faced on Guadalcanal. The groves were not a typical battlefield. They were a maze of towering trees, vines thick as rope, shadows that swallowed sunlight, and platforms of branches perfectly suited for elevated shooting positions. In this environment, even trained scouts struggled to detect movement. For the Japanese sharpshooters, it was paradise. Snipers in the Pacific were not simply soldiers with scoped rifles, they were hunters. Their Arasaka rifles, often equipped with optics, were designed for accuracy at medium range, but their true weapon was patience. A Japanese sniper could climb a banyan tree before sunrise, wedge himself between massive forks in the trunk, and remain there motionless for an entire day. While American troops marched below with their M1 Garands, unaware of the eyes above them, the sniper waited for the perfect angle. A single muzzle flash, a crack echoing through the canopy, and another American fell. This pattern repeated itself day after day, shaping the psychological landscape of the battlefield. Soldiers feared the trees more than the terrain. Every branch felt like a threat. By mid-January 1943, the results were undeniable. Snipers operating in the Point Cruz Groves had killed 14 men in 72 hours, more than malaria did during the same period. Patrols were ambushed while filling canteens, reorganizing gear, or walking the same path twice, proof that the snipers understood American routines intimately. The Groves had become a silent execution ground, and the battalion knew it. Officers whispered about needing specialists trained in sniper tactics, something the U.S. Army at the time barely recognized as a formal discipline. The Marines had battled these same trees for months without fully clearing the threat. Now, the 132nd Infantry faced that same nightmare. This is what made George so different. While the Army relied on standardized weapons like the M1 Garand, George carried his hand-selected Winchester Model 70, equipped with a Lyman Alaskan scope he trusted with his life. His experience wasn't theoretical, it came from competitions where precision, breath control, and reading subtle wind shifts determined success. In jungle warfare, those skills mattered more than fire rate or magazine size. A bolt-action rifle might seem outdated in mass industrial combat, but against expert Japanese snipers, precision beat volume every time. George's rifle, once mocked as a sporting toy, was about to become the most valuable weapon in the battalion. As reports of casualties increased, fear spread among the ranks. Soldiers began moving faster through the groves, avoiding open areas and glancing upward constantly. Rumors circulated about invisible marksmen, ghost-like shooters who hit from impossible angles. The psychological toll was immense. The jungle amplified every crack, making it difficult to determine the shooter's position. Every fallen soldier reinforced the reality that American infantry lacked a true counter-sniper, someone who could read terrain like a map, distinguish natural movement from human motion, and return fire with deadly accuracy. The killings escalated to the point where leadership had no choice but to act. The battalion commander reviewed unit reports, casualty lists, and field maps marking sniper incidents. All arrows pointed to a lethal cluster within the Point Cruz Groves. He realized the enemy's strength wasn't numbers, but dominance of terrain. The Japanese knew every branch, every shadow, every angle of attack within the banyans. They were not simply shooting from trees, they were controlling them. This is when George's name resurfaced. Word spread quietly among officers. The lieutenant with the unusual rifle might be the only man on the island capable of challenging the Japanese on their own terms. When George was summoned, the request was simple but urgent. The commander needed proof. He needed to know if the Winchester Model 70, this rifle so different from the Army's beloved M1 Garand, could neutralize an enemy deeply embedded in a hostile environment. The task wasn't theoretical. The lives of American soldiers depended on the answer. And the Japanese, confident in their mastery of the groves, assumed no one could outshoot them in their own domain. What the battalion didn't yet understand was that George was about to change the momentum of the island campaign. His blend of marksmanship expertise, intimate knowledge of optics like the Lyman Alaskan scope, and instinctive understanding of sniper tactics gave him an edge few soldiers possessed. Against a threat that relied on stillness, elevation, and disguise, George was prepared to bring a different kind of warfare, one built not on numbers, but on precision. The stage was set. The Point Cruz Groves, once ruled entirely by Japanese snipers, were about to witness a counterattack unlike anything seen on Guadalcanal. And for the first time, the Americans had someone who could hunt the hunters. Dawn on January 22, 1943, marked the moment when theory ended and reality began. John George moved quietly into the shattered remains of a Japanese bunker overlooking the Point Cruz Groves. This vantage point, carved into the jungle during earlier marine assaults, gave him a clear line of sight across the banyan trees that the Japanese snipers had turned into their fortress. With only his Winchester Model 70, 60 rounds of ammunition, and absolute trust in his Lyman Alaskan scope, George prepared for the test that would either validate or destroy everything he believed about precision shooting in WWII history. The other men in the battalion carried M1 Garands, powerful semi-automatic rifles designed for the aggressive push of modern infantry. But George wasn't here to lay down suppressive fire. He was here to hunt. The jungle was alive with its usual noise: birds, insects, distant artillery, and the constant hum that defines jungle warfare. None of it distracted George. His focus was on the treetops. He scanned slowly, methodically, applying the same discipline he had mastered in competitive shooting. The magnification of the Lyman Alaskan scope, just 2.5x, may seem modest by modern standards, but George knew exactly how to make it work. He searched for what every skilled marksman looks for: movement, even the slightest unnatural shift among the branches. The banyans were enormous, some stretching 90 feet above the ground, with tangled limbs that made them perfect hideouts for elite Japanese snipers trained in patience and camouflage. At 9:17 a.m., George saw it: the faint, deliberate movement of a branch that had no business swaying in a windless morning. High in a banyan, 240 yards away, the silhouette of a hidden sniper appeared as George adjusted the crosshairs. This was the moment his officers doubted would ever come. The whispers that his mail-order rifle was just a hunting toy faded from relevance. George exhaled, steadied his shot, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester Model 70 kicked against his shoulder with the clean, crisp recoil he knew so well. A split second later, the sniper fell from the tree, branches snapping as the body crashed to the jungle floor. One shot, one confirmed kill, and instantly the battlefield dynamic began to change. But George knew enough about sniper tactics to understand that this was only half a victory. Japanese snipers often worked in pairs: one shooter, one spotter. If he had eliminated the shooter, the spotter was still out there, concealed among the banyans, studying the forest for any hint of where that shot had come from. George continued scanning. At 9:43 a.m., he located the second man, 60 yards north of the first kill, moving down a trunk in a controlled descent. He was retreating, hoping to reposition before George could find him. George led the target, calculated the angle, and fired. The sniper tumbled backwards off the tree, his rifle clattering through the branches. 2 shots, 2 kills. The men who had mocked the Winchester Model 70 would soon learn that this rifle and the man behind it were not to be underestimated. George reloaded from a stripper clip, his motions steady and unhurried. He wasn't simply firing at shapes, he was applying everything he understood about precision in WWII history, where individual skill could still break through the industrial scale of battle. Later that morning, a bullet slammed into the sandbag 6 inches from his head, spraying dirt into his face. The enemy had found him. George tucked himself against the bunker's interior and began studying a new direction, southwest, the angle from which the shot had come. Again, patience became his greatest weapon. Snipers who fired under pressure often repositioned poorly, leaving themselves exposed. At 11:38 a.m., George found his third target, another sniper perched 73 feet up a banyan. One smooth press of the trigger and the figure collapsed. By noon, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers, a feat unheard of in the Point Cruz Groves, where entire platoons had struggled for days. Word began to spread across the battalion. The same soldiers who had laughed at his privately owned rifle now whispered in awe. Some even asked if they could watch him work, but George refused. Spectators made noise. Noise attracted bullets. This wasn't a demonstration, it was survival. As daylight faded, the Japanese suddenly adapted. Movement in the trees stopped. The snipers had realized they were facing someone who could detect tiny shifts in the canopy, someone whose weapon wasn't limited by the conventions of standard infantry rifles like the M1 Garand. For the first time, the hunters were being hunted. George's presence fundamentally disrupted enemy operations, proving that precision marksmanship still had a place in WWII history, even in a war dominated by mass-produced weapons. When George returned to headquarters that evening, the tone among the officers had changed. Gone were the jokes about his sporting rifle. Captain Morris now spoke with respect, perhaps even caution. He asked George to return to the same position at dawn. The battalion had finally realized what George had known all along. In terrain ruled by shadows, height, and silence, the battle would not be won by volume of fire, but by mastery of sniper tactics and the unwavering reliability of the Winchester Model 70. The morning of January 23rd brought heavy tropical rain, the kind that turns the jungle floor into mud and blinds even experienced scouts. For most soldiers on Guadalcanal, bad weather offered a momentary sense of safety. But for John George, it was simply another variable in the unforgiving rhythm of jungle warfare. The enemy would not rest, and neither could he. Armed again with his trusted Winchester Model 70 and its reliable Lyman Alaskan scope, George returned to the ruined bunker overlooking the Point Cruz Groves. The rain cloaked the trees in a gray curtain, reducing visibility to barely 100 yards, but also masking movement. It was exactly the kind of environment in which Japanese snipers excelled. When the skies finally cleared around mid-morning, George resumed scanning the banyans. His patience paid off quickly. At 9:12 a.m., he spotted another sniper, this one nearly 300 yards out, farther than any engagement he had faced the previous day. The Japanese were adapting, increasing their distance in hopes of slipping beyond the reach of American counterfire. But George's mastery of wind, elevation, and trajectory gave him a decisive edge. The Winchester Model 70, built for precise long-range shooting rather than volume fire like the M1 Garand, proved once again why it was the right tool for this hidden war. George compensated for distance and fired. The sniper fell instantly, marking his 6th confirmed kill. But for the first time, the Japanese responded with something more than bullets. At 9:57, mortar rounds began crashing around his position. They had triangulated his location from the sound of his rifle, a clear sign that George had become a priority target. The first shells landed short, the second came closer, the third would kill him if he stayed. George grabbed his rifle and sprinted north through the mud, diving into a shell crater moments before the bunker behind him exploded in a violent burst of debris. It was a stark reminder that sniper tactics were no longer a one-sided contest. The hunters had begun hunting him back. George relocated to a fallen tree with a new vantage of the Point Cruz Groves. Even under pressure, his discipline never wavered. Throughout the afternoon, more Japanese snipers appeared, cautious, deliberate, and increasingly aware that they were facing an opponent who understood their craft. Still, George outmatched them. At 2:23 p.m., he dropped another sniper. At 3:41 p.m., yet another. Every kill reinforced a growing truth. Precision marksmanship, even in an age of semi-automatic rifles and industrial warfare, still had the power to shift battlefield momentum. As the sun lowered, Captain Morris sent for him. George had been on the line for 9 hours, drenched, exhausted, but focused. He reported 8 confirmed kills across 2 days, 12 shots fired, 8 hits. It was an astonishing ratio in any era of WWII history, let alone in the chaotic terrain of Guadalcanal. The battalion, once dismissive of his sporting rifle, now relied on the Winchester Model 70 as their most effective weapon against the invisible threat in the trees. That night, George cleaned the rifle with the same care he had practiced in competition shooting. He reviewed the mathematics in his head. 11 Japanese snipers were known to be operating in the groves. 8 were now dead. The final 3 would be the most skilled, the most cautious, and the most determined to avenge their fallen comrades. George understood the gravity of what awaited him. Tomorrow would not be a contest of equipment, M1 Garand versus Winchester Model 70. It would be a contest of minds, patience, and the purest form of sniper tactics. The duel was far from over. The last and most dangerous snipers were waiting in the shadows, and once again, George would face them alone.
January 24th began with another relentless downpour, the kind that makes even seasoned patrols hesitate before entering the Point Cruz Groves. But John George knew the rain could work both ways. While it reduced visibility, it also muffled sound, giving Japanese snipers a chance to climb into position unnoticed. By the time the rain eased into a drizzle, George had already moved to a new vantage point, refusing to return to the places where the enemy had previously spotted or targeted him. This awareness of movement, concealment, and terrain was the core of true sniper tactics, and George understood it as deeply as any man in World War II history. At 8:17 a.m., he spotted his 9th sniper, perched unusually low in a palm tree, only 40 feet up. For a split second, it seemed almost too easy. The Lyman Alaskan scope revealed the figure's outline through the fronds, and the range wasn't challenging for the Winchester Model 70. Yet George hesitated. After days of counter-sniper duels, this position felt wrong. A seasoned shooter wouldn't choose a spot so easily compromised by an elevated observer. It took only a moment for George's instinct to confirm the truth. This figure was bait. He scanned the groves again, slow, patient, deliberate. At 8:28, he found the real shooter, 91 feet up a banyan tree, perfectly hidden, watching George's previous position near a fallen tree. The enemy had prepared a classic trap. The first sniper was meant to draw fire. The second was positioned to kill anyone who took the shot. It was a sophisticated setup, proof that the Japanese were not merely reacting to George, they were adapting to him. But George adapted faster. He aimed first at the decoy in the palm tree. If he fired at the hidden sniper, the rest of the Japanese team would scatter or counterattack before he could work the bolt of the Winchester Model 70. The bolt-action rifle was unmatched in accuracy, but unlike the semi-automatic M1 Garand, it required deliberate follow-up shots. So George turned their trap against them. He fired at the decoy, and as expected, the hidden sniper shifted toward the sound, movement that broke his perfect camouflage. In that fleeting instant, George swung the crosshairs upward and fired again. Both snipers fell almost simultaneously. 2 shots, 2 kills. The battlefield advantage shifted yet again. But victory rarely comes without consequence. The moment George revealed his new position, a machine gun crew unleashed a burst at the rocks where he had been hiding just seconds earlier. Bullets shredded the foliage and shattered stone. George dove into a drainage ditch filled with cold, murky water. This was jungle warfare in its purest form: silence, patience, and sudden violence. From this muddy crater, he watched the grove again. 10 Japanese snipers were dead. Only 1 remained, the most experienced, the most cautious, and the most dangerous. And this final adversary did something none of the others had attempted. He advanced on foot. At 9:47 a.m., George detected movement near the ground, nearly 60 yards south. The sniper was crawling, using ferns, vines, and fallen branches for cover, moving with the stealth of a predator who understood every inch of the terrain. What followed was a contest of patience that felt almost unnatural in the chaos of World War II history. George stayed submerged to his chin, rifle angled upward to keep water out of the barrel, waiting for the perfect moment. The Japanese sniper reached the rocks George had used earlier, scanning for movement. It should have been an easy shot, but again, something felt off. That position was too exposed, too obvious. Then George saw him, the hidden sniper, hidden behind a fallen tree, rifle trained on the drainage ditch. It wasn't one sniper left, it was two. George could not fire twice before being detected, not with a bolt-action rifle, not at these angles. So he did the only thing he could. He waited. At 10:13, the snipers moved east in a coordinated sweep, passing directly between George's concealed crater and the tree line. Their backs were exposed. George arose from the water, calm and steady, and fired. One fell instantly. He chambered another round and fired again before the second sniper could fully react. The last threats in the Point Cruz Groves collapsed into the jungle floor. George had done what an entire battalion could not achieve in 2 weeks. Through discipline, instinct, and the relentless precision of the Winchester Model 70, he ended a sniper crisis that haunted the regiment and reshaped the path of the Guadalcanal campaign.
For a moment, after dropping the final Japanese snipers in the Point Cruz Groves, John George allowed himself to breathe, only for that brief calm to shatter as quickly as it came. New voices emerged from the jungle, not the controlled whispers of snipers, but louder, hurried commands. These were infantrymen, a recovery team sent to locate the missing shooters. In an instant, George realized the danger had multiplied. Sniper tactics were one thing, precision, concealment, timing. But this was about to become a chaotic firefight, a situation where even the most skilled marksman could be overwhelmed. George slid back into the muddy water of the crater, lowering himself until only his eyes were above the surface. This was pure jungle warfare, cold, tense, and unforgiving. He kept the Winchester Model 70 held vertically to prevent water from entering the barrel, a small but essential detail that separated experienced marksmen from the dead. As the voices closed in, he heard equipment rattling, branches snapping, boots sloshing through wet earth. At least 6 Japanese soldiers were approaching. The hunters had become the hunted. When the first soldier peered over the crater rim, their eyes met. There was no time for hesitation. George fired from the water, dropping the man instantly. 2 more enemy soldiers appeared at the edge of the pit. George worked the bolt of the Winchester Model 70, fired again, and then again, the echo rolling through the groves. In seconds, 3 Japanese infantrymen lay dead. But he only had a few rounds left, and the jungle erupted with shouts in response. Bullets tore into the crater, ripping dirt and foliage apart. George crawled out the far side and sprinted north toward a fallen tree. Rifle fire cracked behind him. Rifles that, unlike his bolt-action weapon, operated closer to the fire rate of an M1 Garand, giving the Japanese a significant advantage in a running fight. George dropped behind the log, reloaded, and scanned through his Lyman Alaskan scope. He spotted 2 more soldiers advancing toward the crater he had just abandoned. At 50 yards, he took the shot, dropping the lead man. The second dove for cover, but the pressure was increasing. More voices echoed from the south and east. The Japanese were flanking him. In that moment, George understood the math. 2 rounds left, multiple enemies closing in, and dense terrain offering little support.
Even the finest marksman in WWII history could not win this exchange. He needed distance, he needed terrain, he needed to disappear. So George did what skilled snipers throughout history have done when the battle shifts out of their favor. He broke contact. He sprinted through vines, branches whipping his face, mud clinging to his boots. The jungle seemed to pull at him, slowing every step, but he pushed on. Bullets snapped through the air, striking trees, chipping bark, chasing him deeper into the groves. After nearly 90 seconds of desperate movement, he found another shell crater, dry this time. He dove inside and pressed himself against the dirt wall, heart pounding, lungs burning. The jungle fell silent. Minutes passed like hours. George strained to hear footsteps, commands, anything that might signal further pursuit. But the Japanese infantry had stopped near their fallen comrades. They were not advancing into unfamiliar terrain. Instead, they consolidated, secured the bodies, and regrouped. George's escape had succeeded. With only 2 rounds remaining, he began the long, tense journey back toward American lines. He moved carefully, low, controlled steps, always using terrain for concealment. Every sound could be danger. Every shadow could be a rifle barrel. The precision and discipline that defined sniper tactics now guided his survival. After nearly 90 seconds of desperate movement, he found another shell crater, dry this time. He dove inside and pressed himself against the dirt wall, heart pounding, lungs burning. The jungle fell silent. Minutes passed like hours. George strained to hear footsteps, commands, anything that might signal further pursuit. But the Japanese infantry had stopped near their fallen comrades. They were not advancing into unfamiliar terrain. Instead, they consolidated, secured the bodies, and regrouped. George's escape had succeeded. With only 2 rounds remaining, he began the long, tense journey back toward American lines. He moved carefully, low, controlled steps, always using terrain for concealment. Every sound could be danger. Every shadow could be a rifle barrel. The precision and discipline that defined sniper tactics now guided his survival. After nearly half an hour of weaving through undergrowth and listening to distant artillery rumble from Henderson Field, George sighted the outline of an American perimeter. A Marine sentry called out, rifle raised. George identified himself and stepped through the defensive line, exhausted, soaked, and carrying a rifle spattered with mud and water, but still functional. He made his way to battalion headquarters, where Captain Morris demanded a full account. George reported 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days, plus 3 infantrymen in the firefight. 12 rounds fired at the snipers, 11 hits. For the first time, the battalion understood the magnitude of what George had accomplished. The Point Cruz Groves, once dominated by enemy sharpshooters, were now clear. The deadly reign of the Japanese marksmen had ended, not through artillery, not through massed infantry, not through superior firepower like the M1 Garand, but through patience, precision, instinct, and the unwavering performance of the Winchester Model 70. The jungle tried to swallow him, but he walked out alive.
When John George returned from the Point Cruz Groves, exhausted and carrying only 2 remaining rounds for his Winchester Model 70, he expected little more than brief acknowledgement and a day of rest. Instead, his commanding officers, now fully aware of what he had accomplished, summoned him for a very different reason. Word had already traveled up the chain of command. One officer with a bolt-action rifle had succeeded where platoons of infantry carrying M1 Garands had failed. The elimination of 11 Japanese snipers in 4 days reshaped how the regiment viewed precision shooting in World War II history. The battalion no longer saw George's rifle as a sporting weapon, they saw it as a solution. The proposal was simple, yet unprecedented. The regiment wanted George to train a dedicated sniper section, something the U.S. Army had never formally established on Guadalcanal. When Colonel Ferry met with him, he asked the question that would change the next stage of George's wartime career. Can you train other men to do what you've done?
George, still bruised, sore, and exhausted from days of jungle warfare, answered honestly, yes, if they had the right rifles, the right optics, and the discipline to master true sniper tactics. The Army had 14 Springfield rifles equipped with long unertl scopes abandoned earlier by Marine units. They also had 40 men who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment, but none of them had faced what George had faced: the silence, the stillness, the sudden crack of a rifle hidden high in the banyans. None had stalked an enemy trained in concealment or matched wits with Japanese snipers who used the terrain like a weapon. George accepted the assignment, but he insisted on one condition: he would keep his Winchester Model 70. It was more than a rifle now. It was part of the doctrine he intended to teach. Training began on January 27th, east of Henderson Field. The men gathered at a makeshift range cut into the jungle, standing in mud, humidity, and relentless heat. George knew he couldn't teach them everything overnight, but he could teach them the fundamentals that matter in real combat: breathing control, trigger discipline, reading wind, and managing recoil, skills the average M1 Garand rifleman rarely needed to consider in depth. The Springfield rifles were heavier and more cumbersome than his Winchester, but in skilled hands they were deadly accurate. For 3 days, George drilled them on precision, hitting stationary targets at 100 to 400 yards, then transitioning to moving silhouettes, and finally engaging partially concealed targets designed to mimic the shadows and foliage of jungle warfare. Many failed at first. They were used to the rapid rhythm of the Garand, not the patient, deliberate pace of a sniper's craft. But slowly, under George's guidance, they adapted. By the 3rd day, 32 of the 40 men could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. That was enough. George paired them into 16 two-man teams, shooter and spotter. This structure mirrored the tactics of elite units across World War II history. While the shooter focused on precision, the spotter tracked wind, distance, and threats, carrying an M1 Garand for close defense. They would switch roles after each engagement, ensuring both men developed the full spectrum of skills. It was a system built not just for performance, but for resilience. No single marksman could become a bottleneck or a liability. On February 1st, George led 4 of these sniper teams into the field for their first real mission. Their objective was simple: clear Japanese stragglers who were still operating west of the Guadalcanal River. These weren't elite Japanese snipers, but infantrymen acting as a rearguard during the evacuation of Guadalcanal. Still, George treated the mission with the seriousness it deserved. Snipers do not rely on chance, they rely on preparation. From a ridge overlooking a narrow trail used by Japanese soldiers, George and his spotter, Corporal Hayes, settled in. At 7:20 a.m., the first target appeared. Hayes confirmed the sight picture, and George fired, the familiar, crisp recoil of the Winchester Model 70 doing exactly what it had done in the Groves. Over the next 6 hours, their team eliminated 7 more soldiers with the same deadly efficiency. Across the other sniper teams, 23 Japanese troops were killed without a single American casualty. The results were undeniable. Sniper tactics, properly taught, properly supplied, and properly executed, worked. They provided reach, control, and precision in terrain where infantry squads struggled to operate. Through skill, discipline, and the quiet power of well-placed shots, George's newly trained section began shaping the battlefield in ways far beyond raw firepower. In only 12 days of operations, the sniper section recorded 74 confirmed kills. Every one of them was a reminder that in a war dominated by mass-produced weapons, individual skill still mattered, and every kill reinforced what George already knew: the Winchester Model 70, the discipline of marksmanship, and the art of patience could do what entire battalions with M1 Garands sometimes could not. George's role was changing, but his mission was far from over. When John George left Guadalcanal, he carried with him not only the memory of the Point Cruz Groves, but the hard-earned lessons of jungle warfare, lessons that would soon define his next mission. As the Japanese evacuation of the island ended, George was reassigned to a classified operation. By March 1943, he found himself sailing west across the Pacific, his Winchester Model 70 wrapped in oilcloth, secured like a trusted companion. The Army needed experienced officers for a new long-range penetration unit bound for Burma. That unit would soon become famous in WWII history as Merrill's Marauders. Burma was unlike Guadalcanal in almost every way. Guadalcanal's jungle was dense and dangerous, but Burma's terrain pushed soldiers to their physical limits: steep mountains, deep valleys, endless humidity, and rain that fell like sheets of steel. The Marauders would operate far behind enemy lines, with no fixed supply chain and no margin for error. Every ounce of gear had to matter, which is why George modified his weapon. He replaced the heavier Lyman Alaskan scope with a lighter Weaver optic and swapped the wooden stock for a synthetic one. The result was a slimmer, more agile Winchester Model 70, better suited for treks of hundreds of miles. But Burma's combat was very different from the sniper duels of Guadalcanal. Engagements were fast, chaotic, and often occurred at close range, distances where the semi-automatic M1 Garand dominated. The Marauders rarely encountered the stationary Japanese snipers George had hunted before. Instead, their enemies used ambushes, mortar fire, and rapid withdrawal tactics. Still, George's marksmanship proved invaluable. 3 times during the long march, he used the Winchester to take out high-value targets at distances over 300 yards, an officer directing troops, a machine gun crew, and a concealed shooter pinning down an American patrol. 3 shots, 3 kills. The march through Burma lasted nearly 3 months. Disease, malaria, dysentery, typhus, claimed more marauders than bullets. The terrain broke mules, shattered stamina, and tested morale. Yet the unit pushed on, eventually capturing the vital Mitsina airfield in May 1944. It was one of the most grueling campaigns in WWII history, and by its end, the Marauders were no longer a fighting force, but a collection of survivors. George survived the ordeal, but he noticed something important. The nature of warfare was changing. The Winchester Model 70, unmatched for precision, was not always the ideal weapon in the rapid, close-quarters engagements common in Burma. The M1 Garand, with its faster rate of fire, fit the new style of combat better. George saw firsthand that sniper tactics, while still vital, required adaptation in environments where mobility and volume of fire often outweighed long-range precision. Still, the rifle he carried continued to speak loudly when it mattered. Even in a theater dominated by artillery, mortars, and infantry assaults, the quiet certainty of a single, well-placed shot remained a powerful tool. The lessons George had learned on Guadalcanal did not fade, they evolved. When the Burma campaign ended and Merrill's Marauders were finally withdrawn, John George returned to the United States carrying a rare combination of battlefield experience that few soldiers in WWII history could claim. He had survived the brutal demands of jungle warfare in 2 radically different theaters, fought elite Japanese snipers in the Point Cruz Groves, and witnessed firsthand how the nature of combat was shifting toward faster, more chaotic engagements, where weapons like the M1 Garand increasingly shaped the battlefield. Through all of it, the constant thread in his story was the rifle that never failed him, the Winchester Model 70. Back home, George was promoted to captain and stationed at Fort Benning, where the Army finally recognized the value of the skills he had developed under fire. His new mission was to teach the next generation of officers how to move, shoot, and think with the discipline of a marksman. He emphasized reading terrain, controlling breathing, understanding wind, and applying practical sniper tactics, the very principles that had allowed him to outshoot the enemy on Guadalcanal. His lessons were not theoretical. They came from experience earned in the mud, the trees, and the silence of the Pacific jungles. The Winchester Model 70 stayed with him through this new phase, stored in a footlocker, still oiled and perfectly maintained. It bore the marks of its long journey, from Tennessee to Guadalcanal, from the Point Cruz Groves to the mountains of Burma. Yet, George rarely spoke about what the rifle had accomplished. Colleagues knew he served in the Pacific, but few realized that he had eliminated 11 Japanese snipers alone,
or that his actions had reshaped how his regiment understood precision shooting in WWII history. In 1947, driven by the need to document the technical, tactical, and psychological realities of combat before those details faded, George wrote Shots Fired in Anger. The book was not a dramatic memoir, but a detailed examination of weapons performance, field conditions, and the realities of jungle warfare. His analysis of rifles, including the Springfield, the M1 Garand, and his trusted Winchester Model 70, became foundational reading for marksmen, historians, and collectors. His descriptions of Japanese equipment remain among the most accurate contemporary accounts surviving from the war. George later built a respected academic and diplomatic career, studying at Princeton, researching politics in East Africa, and eventually serving in Washington, D.C. Yet the lessons he had carried from Guadalcanal and Burma continued to influence U.S. military doctrine as sniper roles became formalized, with advanced optics replacing the old Lyman Alaskan scope and new rifles evolving far beyond the tools of his era. He lived long enough to witness the Korean War, Vietnam, and the Gulf Wars reshape global conflict. Despite all these changes, one truth remained constant: precision, patience, and disciplined marksmanship never stopped mattering. John George passed away in 2009 at the age of 90. After his death, the Winchester Model 70 that had changed the fate of the Point Cruz Groves was donated to the National Firearms Museum. Today, it sits behind glass, unnoticed by many visitors who walk past without knowing its story. To most, it looks like any other hunting rifle, but to those who understand its history, it represents the quiet proof that one disciplined marksman can alter the course of a battle with nothing more than skill, courage, and a well-placed shot. And if stories like this matter to you, if you believe these forgotten pieces of WWII history deserve to stay alive, then make sure to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring these remarkable stories back into the light, where they belong.